A life that is not documented is a life that within a generation or two will largely be lost to memory.
Oh, once I lived in Cottonwood and owned a little farm. When they called me down to Dixie, it caused me much alarm. To hoe the cane and cotton, I right away must go. But the reason why they sent me, I'm sure I do not know.
Welcome to Not Forgotten, a podcast brought to you by the Doc Booth Foundation and hosted by noted writer Lyman, who has chronicled the stories, culture, and character of Utah's Dixie for more than 40 years.
I have two truly special people in the studio today, Katherine Gardner Staheli and her son, Burke Staheli. I'm going to introduce them in a few minutes, but first I want to share a piece I wrote 20 years ago about Katherine's father and Burke's grandfather, Wayne Gardner. It's entitled, Where Sheep May Safely Graze, and it appeared in my book, Home Ground. From time to time, when my errand takes me that way, I turn off St. George Boulevard and head north on 100 West. Midway up the block, there's a beautiful white home on the west side of the street, set back behind a gloriously green lawn and beds of bright flowers. It is the home where Bessie MacArthur Gardner lived as a widow the entire second half of the 20th century. She lived to the age of 104. I cannot pass that picturesque place without recalling one of the seminal stories of St. George history. This business of calling forth a story at every turn is one of the blessings or curses of belonging to a place. There are stories you grow up with that are so full of meaning and power, they work themselves firmly into the fabric of who and what you are. In my life, one of those stories is the account of Wayne Gardner's heroic attempt to rescue his hired hand and stranded livestock on a far-off ridge of the Arizona Strip during the killing blizzards of January 1949. I never knew Wayne Gardner. He died 6 years before I was born, but my father planted an image of the man in my mind when I was very young, and it's remained there with a haunting resonance ever since. I've always admired Wayne Gardner as a symbol of the kind of men I grew up around. They are men who live life close to the bone, close to the fragile line between what is flesh and what is spirit. Men who've spent their lives in the landscape on horseback among livestock. In that distinction, wrote Thomas McGuane, lies an intimation of mortality that makes stockmen of every kind powerful company. It's been my fortune to enjoy that kind of powerful company all my life. I wish I could have known Wayne Gardner, yet I feel I know him in a small way for having known men like him. He was part of a unique fraternity of civilized cowboys, educated, business-wise family men who are just as persuasive at teaching a Sunday school class as they are moving a herd of sheep to new pasture, just as knowledgeable about legislation pending before Congress as they are of subtle changes in the vegetation on their ranges. These are men who know their individual animals as well as they know their own children and treat them both with respect and care and a sincere concern for the next generation. Before his untimely death, Wayne Gardner had established himself as a fine husband and father, as well as a devout churchman. Among his peers in the livestock business, he was known as a shrewd, productive, innovative, and successful rancher who owned a strong sense of the future. He'd established a winter range for his sheep in the Pigeon Breaks area of the Arizona Strip, some 75 miles south of St. George, and obtained a beautiful private piece of Cedar Mountain where he summered his stock. In 1936, he was called to Washington, D.C. to help draft the Range Code under the newly passed Taylor Grazing Act. That was a singular honor and a huge responsibility. It was a crucial juncture for stockmen, a time of drastic change in the way they made a living. Wayne was asked to represent his fellow ranchers in the nation's capital because he had proven himself not only as an astute student of the range, but also as a leader. James Andrus said of Wayne Gardner, he had the ability to express himself clearly and in a convincing manner. In a leadership capacity, he assumed responsibility and backed it with vision, willpower, courage, self-reliance, resourcefulness, and enthusiasm. He had the ability to make decisions and take initiative. He also had the quality of human kindness and cooperation, which is needed in a war-torn world to promote a spirit of peace among the people of the earth. These were attributes Wayne Gardner inherited from his parents, Thomas and Mary Elizabeth Cummings Gardner. Born in August of 1899 and raised in a Latter-day Saint home in the red sands of Utah's Dixie, he literally grew up with the new century. His initiation into manhood occurred on the ranges of the Arizona Strip as he worked horseback in his father's cattle operation. As a young man, he served a mission for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and upon returning, became a student at Dixie College. His contemporaries remember well his sense of humor, his love for a good, clean joke or an outrageous prank, and how, when he laughed all over. He married Elizabeth Bessie MacArthur in December of 1925. They eventually established their beautiful home on First West, a home characterized by a spacious front yard of glistening grass and bounteous flowers. They became the parents of 5 children. They were the quintessential St. George family in that generation, brought up in the Mormon tradition of hard work and joyful play. By the time the winter of 1948-49 rolled in, their daughter Betty Lou was 22 years old. Robert was 20 and serving a mission in South Africa. Marietta was 16, Reed 11, and Katherine was a 6-year-old in first grade. Bessie, their devoted mother, was a beautiful woman at middle age, busily engaged in the tasks of raising a family and supporting her progressive rancher husband. As she sent her husband out the door early every morning, she must have, as all ranch wives do, worried profoundly about him until he finally stepped back through the door at night. Deep in the recesses of every ranch wife's thoughts lies the distinct, inexpressible truth that there may come a day when her husband won't return. Bessie was one who would come to know the actual terror of that nightmare. Yet she was one who would heroically survive it and somehow transcend it. There are many heroes in this story, but Bessie Gardner emerges as its ultimate heroine. She is a living example of what the human spirit is capable of bearing, and of how even the heaviest load can be borne with courage, dignity, and grace. Those few times I've been in Bessie's home, I have been struck by the beauty and peace that abides there. It is the home of a proud, capable, and strong woman. Each time, as I've gone to the door to leave, I've felt her firm, warm handshake and have become immersed in her radiant smile. And then I look at the photograph. There, near the door, sits a photo of her beloved husband who walked out that door one dark winter morning and never returned. Bessie Gardner's life would never be the same after January 15, 1949. The rug was mercilessly yanked out from under her in one sad and inexplicable event. Yet she continued, constant. Her life changed, but she did not. During that last week, her husband had been worried about his hired sheep herder, Ed Harrington, who was alone with 1,400 head of sheep in the pigeon breaks of the Arizona Strip. Wayne had left early on January 12th to try to get to him, but had made it only to Wolf Hole, where the snow was falling so hard and was piled so deep he had to turn back. On the 13th, he made a second attempt by way of Mesquite and Riverside, Nevada, intending to follow the road up through the Grand Wash past the Grand Gulch mine. This time, a flat tire turned him back. He left again in his green Chevrolet truck on the morning of the 14th, having been told that the road through Wolf Hole might now be passable. But the snow was still too difficult to drive through. The Arizona Strip had become a rolling white blanket. All this time, Wayne was growing more and more worried about Ed Harrington, that he would be out of grub and that he would need help moving the sheep to lower country. On Saturday morning, January 15th, Wayne Gardner awoke at 3 a.m., turned to Bessie, and said he believed he would get up and be on his way. As he made ready to leave that morning, Bessie noticed he was wearing a funny-looking old dress hat. She said, "Surely you're not going to wear that hat." Wayne smiled, and with a characteristic twinkle in his eye replied, "I'm not going to a fashion show." He didn't want to ruin his nice Stetson in the snow. Bessie had tried all week to persuade Wayne to take someone with him. Wayne felt another man would only be in the way. He had known the country all his life, and he could find his way blindfolded in it. "Now, don't worry if I'm gone several days," he assured Bessie. "I may have to help Ed off the top with the sheep." On this, his fourth attempt, Wayne Gardner walked out the door of his house for the last time and drove off toward the Arizona Strip by way of Mesquite and the Grand Wash. The day passed, and the winter blizzard continued to pound the Arizona Strip. Another day passed, and there was no word from Wayne. By the third day, Bessie had begun to worry and started making some phone calls. After 5 days, the people of the grazing service started to investigate the situation, and Sheriff Antone Prince began looking for a way to get a search plane up, but the weather would not permit it. On Sunday, January 23rd, 8 days after Wayne had left town, Maurice Miles flew his plane out as far as he could before the storm forced him back. All he saw was a white blanket in every direction, and he, as well as everyone else, knew that anyone stranded out there would be in dire need of help. On the 24th, Ras Gardner, Ellis Larson, and Reed Mathis loaded their horses in a truck and headed out the same route Wayne had gone. They discovered Wayne's abandoned truck up the Grand Wash, and they went on as far as they could before setting out horseback. Following Wayne's tracks up Coyote Canyon, they rode as far as they could until their horses bellied up in the snow. They returned to St. George to form a search party that would set out again, this time through Wolf Hole. It was known now that Wayne had made it to within 12 miles or so of his sheep camp, but no one knew if he had actually made it all the way to the camp. On the 25th, Maurice Miles was finally able to fly over the sheep camp by plane. Rudger Atkin flew with him and dropped notes to the herder, Ed Harrington. Through a series of notes and signaled replies, they were able to determine that Harrington was very much in need of help and that he was alone. This was the news that no one wanted to hear. At this point, any hope that anyone still harbored of finding Wayne Gardner alive melted like a spring thaw. Under the direction of the grazing service and Sheriff Antone Prince, an official posse set out in search of the lost stockman. Among the posse were Dean Gardner, Anthony Clayton and Rudger Atkin, Rulin and Bruce Snow, Darrell Bracken, Mila Snyder, Ralston Barber, Evan Whitehead, Reed Mathis, Lawrence Iverson, Roland Esplin, Deloy Johnson, who served as cook, and Atwood Bundy, who drove the supply truck. Manning the bulldozers and spearheading the posse were Arnold and Walter MacArthur, Evan Woodbury, Wayne Sims, and Bliss Jarvis. E.S. Rass Gardner directed the search. Groups from Mesquite, Bunkerville, and Las Vegas set out in search of Wayne from the Grand Wash side. The posse left St. George on January 29th, 2 weeks to the day since Wayne had left home. It took them 3 days to make the same trip, which today takes less than 3 hours. They camped the first night at Little Tank, in temperatures dipping as low as 28 degrees below zero. The second night, they made camp at Poverty Mountain. During the 10 days they were out, the search plane flew over daily. If anything was needed, they wrote it in the snow and received it on the next flight. One delivery was a heavy military tent that tumbled out of the sky and knocked the smokestack off Arnold MacArthur's bulldozer. The tent bumped Arnold as well and would have killed him had it landed squarely upon him. The sheep herder, Ed Harrington, was rescued and soon headed to town to recuperate. Meanwhile, the posse members continued their search for Wayne and moved the sheep to lower country. During the previous fall, Wayne had stored concentrated feed under the branches of juniper trees along the breaks for the sheep to feed on in winter. Ed Harrington had distributed all the concentrated feed by now and had even resorted to cutting cedar limbs for the animals to eat. Search as they did, the posse found no trace of Wayne Gardner and returned to St. George on February 7th. They soon set out again, taking hunting dogs with them this time. Wayne's brother-in-law, Darrell Bracken, and Ellis Larson were searching through the snow near the side of the original sheep camp when they found 8 head of sheep marooned along the Pigeon Breaks. As they trailed the sheep back to camp, Ellis saw a hat lodged in the branches of a tree. The two had felt a spooky feeling all day as icicles dropped upon crusty snow, sending strange echoes through the trees. They had also crossed a set of cougar tracks. When they got to the hat, they were discouraged to find that it was an old dress hat, not at all like the kind they were accustomed to seeing Wayne wear. They came back to town on February 13th, very disheartened. Still no trace of Wayne. The sheriff called off the search until the snow melted. Darrell Bracken and his wife Ina, Bessie's sister, visited the distraught Gardner family to report on the latest search efforts. During the conversation, Darrell mentioned finding the strange hat. When he described it, Bessie knew immediately it was the hat Wayne had put on the morning before he left. Knowing now that Wayne must have made it to somewhere near the sheep camp, a group of his friends convinced the sheriff to make one more try. They set out from St. George the morning of February 15th, confident they would find their friend this time, yet heavy-hearted with the knowledge that they would not find him alive. Sheriff Prince, Darrell Bracken, Brass and Rex Gardner, and Andrew MacArthur left early in the morning. Less than an hour after arriving at the spot where they had found the hat, they discovered the exposed shoulder of Wayne Gardner's body beneath a trimmed juniper tree. As they dug him out of the snow, they found he was encased in ice. He looked like he had been sitting with his back to the tree trunk. One hand was in his coat, the other out as if he had been blowing on his fingers to warm them. It appeared as if he had stopped there, within sight of his destination across the draw, weary and exhausted, and had squatted down to rest for a moment. He might have been making ready to build a fire. Apparently, he had gone to sleep in that position and frozen to death. It was 1 month to the day since Wayne had left home. As his daughter Mary Ada later wrote, it was the longest, loneliest, coldest, and most snow-covered month we had ever gone through. Mother was a tower of strength and courage, and still is to this day. We can't know exactly what happened on that juniper-studded ridge of the Arizona Strip on a heartless, cold day more than 75 years ago. We don't know whether Wayne Gardner was overcome with exhaustion, whether he was trying to build a fire, whether he could actually see his sheep camp a short distance away. We only know that somehow he made his way through deep snow from the place where he left his truck, some 12 to 14 miles away, to the little patch of earth beneath a juniper tree where he died. We know that he stopped there for some reason, and that his mortal life, whether in peaceful sleep or agonizing pain, ended beneath those juniper boughs. He was but a stone's throw or two from safety, but the miles he put behind him that day, struggling through the deep freezing drifts, climbing the considerable elevation from the Grand Wash Cliffs to the Pigeon Breaks, must have taken their toll. We know that he had pushed that far and done everything he could to reach his stranded hired man, to rescue his marooned animals, to fulfill the heavy stewardship that was his. We know he died in that most worthy pursuit. It was a sad time in Utah's Dixie, one still remembered by many with reverence. During the funeral, Stake President Harold S. Snow said of Wayne Gardner, "I believe he knew practically every sheep he had. I believe he could tell them if he saw them in somebody else's herd and didn't know what brand it had on. He took very good care of them. It was not for the money there was in it. It was his love for those animals, and he didn't want them to suffer." There was only one villain in this story. It was the wicked winter of 1949. Everyone else was a hero. But when it was finally over, there was no happy ending. The heartless winter prevailed. Yet, as I drive by the handsome Gardner home today and consider all that it signifies, I can't help but feel that the indomitable spirit that pushed Wayne Gardner out the door of that house on an early January morning more than 75 years ago did not succumb to the cold and the snow and the freezing winds of the heartless winter of 49. That spirit survived that deadly storm, and it still lives. It lives in a peaceful and comfortable place where grass grows tall and winter winds never blow, a place where sheep may safely graze. And it lives in the eyes and the hearts of those few true stockmen who remain among us. I believe it will continue to live as long as there are families like the Gardners, as long as there are those whose lives are tied to the land in intimate ways, as long as their stories remain connected to their places, just as this one is connected to that beautiful white house on First West. I feel so blessed today. It's the 2nd of February, and we're here on a beautiful sunshiny day in the studio, and with me are Katherine Gardner Staheli and her son Burke Staheli, and I feel so fortunate today to be with both of you and to be able to visit with you, Katherine, about your dear father and mother, and Burke, about your amazing grandfather and grandmother. And Katherine, you're such an awesome person. You married my cousin, Ralph Staheli, and that's an awesome thing in and of itself. And your family is such an amazing and wonderful family. And you have done so many great things in your life. You remind me, even though I didn't know your mother that well, you remind me a lot of Bessie. And I think you have that spark in your heart about history and about family and about even that spirit of Elijah that ties all of these things together. You've done so many wonderful histories and brought stories together in so many beautiful ways. And I'm so excited to be able to talk with you today and also with your great son, Burke. You're an educator, but that doesn't even begin to describe who you are. You've been a principal and an amazing legendary teacher, a coach, an athletic coach, and successful in so many ways. You're currently on the county school board. I just feel so blessed to be with both of you today. And Katherine, I'd love to have you talk to us a little bit more about your father and your mother. We realize you were only 6 when your father died, but give us some more insight into this incredible story.
Well, for one thing, I was so blessed to have siblings that were old enough to remember things and write them down, because that has given me so much comfort to read about my father, because as a little child, I knew him when he was my daddy, and they knew him as father. And just reading the past couple of days, just going through things, I think not everybody has all of this history that has been kept by everyone. And I know it meant a lot to my mother that I put things together about my dad, because she loved that. And she was good to keep histories of her family, but she didn't write her own history, so I'm in the process of that. But my little girl stories, there's not a lot of them, but I knew that I was treasured, as he was 44 when I was born, and so I was totally spoiled, probably. But he had more time for me, and I went everywhere with him. If he went to run an errand, he took me along. And I remember, I'll never forget planting pansies and snapdragons with him around our home.
So that cowboy planted pansies and snapdragons in the yard.
Absolutely. He loved the yards to look beautiful. He was as interested in them as my mother was. They were great that way. They loved flowers.
And I remember that yard, even within my memory, how beautiful it was. So that was just carried forward all the way back. I remember reading one line and the image in my mind of your dad walking you to school.
Yes. He walked me to kindergarten even when I didn't want to go. I wanted to stay home.
So there again, this cowboy, this sheep man, and this man of the Arizona Strip is walking his precious little daughter to school.
And as I've read the things that my brothers and sisters have said, he was always the gentle one. Mother was the disciplinarian, and then he'd come along and he'd say, now, you know why she was upset? And he'd talk to us or talk to them. Of course, I never did anything wrong, so I have to be disciplined for it that time. But that's been sweet as they've written about that. I can just see that in him by the way, the things that he's written and things that I've heard about him was that he was loving and kind, and they all said that he was an encouraging father and a loving father.
And Burke, tell us from your perspective about your grandpa. Even though you didn't know him personally, you studied his life thoroughly.
Well, I'm glad you have us here, Lyman. This is fun to be here with my mom, and feel like I'm representing a whole bunch of cousins and brothers and sisters. Probably my love or my desire is since I was a little kid, everybody would tell me that I looked like my Grandpa Gardner. You look just like your Grandpa Gardner. And then being in the places that he loved to be, especially Cedar Mountain. So my whole life, and I thank my mom for this, and my grandma, I've been learning about this man that died when my mom was 6. But I feel like I know him better than any other of my relatives. Anyone. I could tell you the places he's been and all about him, but it's all been because people have told me. And then I've had the opportunity to tell people. So for me, it's just been wanting to be like him since I was a little kid. On Cedar Mountain, my grandma had this cream-colored Chrysler car with cold leather, these leather seats, and we took her car and we'd take a little picnic. I didn't even realize my grandma was old, really. She was born in 1898, and so when I was 12, she would have been 77 years old. And she would hike with us and take us down to their homes, the old homestead cabin, and tell us stories. And so anyway, I've just wanted to be like him my whole life because I look like him and want to be like him. Yeah.
And that's awesome to have that kind of legacy to draw from.
Yes.
I've felt like that when I've looked at photos of your grandpa and I look at you in action and I think, I'm getting a chance to see what Wayne Gardner must have been like.
Yeah, I wish I'm probably not a very good horseman or a very good, but I love the land. I know that's a part of it. And I love the places that he loved. I love to walk where he's walked, especially Cedar Mountain. Yeah, our place on Cedar Mountain.
That's awesome.
But anyway.
Well, Katherine, tell us a little more about your mom and your dad. And how they came together, how this great Gardner family was formed.
Quite interesting. I don't know that it's been mentioned in anything, but he was student body president at Dixie College. And Mother had been going with him. And then he went on a mission.
And your mom is a MacArthur.
Yes.
With deep roots.
Oh, very deep.
As deep as they get in St. George.
And they had gone together. And then he went on his mission, and he was on his mission almost 3 years because they started another stake down in California. And somehow the story goes that Grandma Gardner, my grandmother Gardner, wanted this girl to marry him, that her dad was a big deal sheep man up in northern Utah. And so she had really worked at that they got together as soon as this girl came home from her mission also. That didn't sail too well with my mother. And I wish I could have recorded my mother telling the story because it was so sweet. Because she said after a while he came into the class that she was teaching and said, "Okay, kid, how long are you going to be mad at me?" To hear her tell it, and I was driving, so I couldn't do a thing about it. I couldn't write it down. But they were 27 years old when they got married. They didn't get married real young.
Uh-huh.
But that was their choice. My mother said I wasn't sure I was old enough then to get married. So.
But she had been teaching.
She'd been teaching.
And was she teaching at Dixie?
I think she was teaching at Dixie College.
Uh-huh.
Because in what little story she did write, she said that she didn't have a degree at the time they asked her. And they said, "Yes, but you've got enough common sense that you know what you're doing."
That sounds like Bessie.
Yeah.
I would have loved to have had her for a teacher.
Yeah, she taught clothing and
Really?
And she taught the third grade. She taught 3 different type things while she was teaching. So
I remember her in the years before she passed away, and just what an elegant, competent, beautiful, and awesome person.
And she was a
lady.
She was very ladylike, but not prissy. There wasn't, that part of her wasn't in her.
And I always felt like when I was in her presence that she knew who I was and that she respected me, and it gave me confidence.
Yes.
What I'm trying to say is I would have loved to have had her for a teacher.
Well, she was very good friends with your Grandma Hafen. They were in the state primary together. And they were the same type women. Your grandma had a little more wit than my mother had, but...
Well, I remember being in her home, in your home, and how beautiful it was, and that yard, as we've already expressed. Tell me about her as a homemaker.
Well, when my brother bought the home, he said, "Oh, your mother was a hoarder." It wasn't long after that he came back and he says, "I'm sorry I said that. Your mother was a historian. Nothing that she kept was trash. It was all history." And there was 25 boxes of history that she left. And she loved the primary. That was her favorite calling in the church. And so she had every children's friend from the time they started, every Relief Society magazine. She loved her church callings and loved to work with the Shivwood Indian branch. She loved working with those sisters.
Tell us about her relationship with Wayne, with your father.
You got to tell that.
As a team, how did they work together?
My father didn't swear, but the Gardners, my grandparents and my mother and father owned a car together. And my dad had gone up to the lambing ground. They'd taken him up in the morning. And that's way north of town, up where the turtles are now, I presume. And she was supposed to go pick him up at a certain time. But the Gardners wanted to drive somewhere, and so they'd gone, and she'd forgotten all about it. And she was standing in the kitchen, and he came around the side of the house, and she remembered. And she said to him, "Did you walk all the way home?" And he said, "Every damn step of the way." And she told me that story many times because that wasn't him to get upset, but he was a little annoyed with her. But they were very sweet with each other, and the siblings have told me how sweet they would talk to each other and very...
Didn't he have a little nickname for her? What did he call her?
He called her a mutt a lot, or maybe she called him a mutt. That might have been how it was, but...
He bought her a lot of pretty things.
Yes, gifts were very important to him. When he'd go on these Taylor grazing, he'd always bring her a new dress home. He loved to buy her a new dress.
That's awesome.
And the Christmas before he passed away, he had my Aunt Lavera buy her a mink coat. I don't know whether it was mink, but it was a fur coat. And then he found out that Mother really wanted this little figurine or something. And so he went in with Grandma MacArthur so that they both spent some money on that. And that was such a surprise to her, and she was so thrilled. And that was the year that she bought him the saddle. And I remember that saddle sitting on, what do you call them, the saddle holders?
Saddle tree.
Yeah. When they were looking for him. It was still in the living room when they were out looking for him. I remember that as that 6-year-old girl. That's one thing. It bothered me that it was in there, but...
Wayne Gardner was, like many men in Dixie, he was a livestock man, he was horseman, he was a cowboy, he was all of these things, but he was also a community leader and someone who was involved civically in town. He lived
he wasn't it?
And lived in a beautiful home in the middle of town, but his work was way out on the Arizona Strip or up on Cedar Mountain with the livestock. And that's an interesting combination. I know it's not unique to St. George or Dixie, but there were so many men who they were church leaders, they were community leaders in town, but then they were most of their time out on the range. And how did that work for your mom and dad?
Well, they worked a really good plan and it saved my mother a lot. when he would come home at night, he had a little teeny book up in the cupboard, and he would write any deals he'd made with anyone that day and what he had done. And if someone owed him money or if he owed someone money, it was written in that book. And so after he'd passed away, when someone came to the house and said, well, Wayne owes me money, she went right to the book and told him where Wayne had written that he had paid him and how much. And she didn't question what was going on because he talked everything over with her, which is a good thing.
Yes.
I've always thought of him in my mind, a lot of it because the way he dressed. He'd wear khaki pants and a khaki shirt and a nice hat. And when you talk about that he liked to do flowers in the yard and he was a prankster, but I've always thought of him as like a gentleman rancher or like an educated rancher, a classy. He wasn't really big. He may have weighed 150 pounds. He wasn't really a big man. And I know Mom's going to talk about just before he left to go out to try and rescue the sheep in the years before he passed away, of all the ranchers, of all the representatives of southern Utah, he was chosen to go to Washington, D.C. I think he was a water witcher. Was he a water witcher or just his son, Robert?
I think just Robert.
But they built ponds, and there's a Gardner pond out on the strip, and he was a visionary, I think. He was a sheep man amongst cattlemen out there, too, and your family and our family and the Bundys, but he had this ability. They chose him to go back and represent Utah, represent this area to make the Taylor Grazing Act, which was basically to say we can't overgraze this land. We need to set some standards and some rules. And he just had the way. I picture him as a mediator, smart enough to know, but had the voice enough to get everybody to get along because they knew he knew what he was talking about.
The respect of his peers.
Yes,
Which,
yeah. He wasn't a bully, but he knew what he was talking about. That's what I've always thought about him. I could picture him back there. Can't imagine what it would take to get to Washington, D.C. in the 40s. But,
well, and there again, this boy who grew up in this little town of St. George, back there in Washington, D.C.,
yeah,
doing that work. And it's amazing to think about the courage and the competence and all that it took to be able to do that.
Yeah.
But he was sure of himself. He wasn't real proud of himself, but he was sure that when he spoke for himself, he also spoke for other people, that he listened to their concerns also.
And you've mentioned, Katherine, how he was very diplomatic, but also effective and forceful in his way of negotiating or working through those things. That's really great to think about that. That was such a key time in the 1930s with the Taylor Grazing Act and how all of that came together and how it might have gone in different directions. But we still, basically, we're still operating under that model that Wayne Gardner helped to create. My goodness, this is amazing to think about this man and what he did really in a shortened life.
Right.
And I wondered if maybe you could share with us what it was about Wayne Gardner that thrust him out of the house in the middle of January out into probably the worst storm, the worst snow that we've ever experienced in this area.
Well, if I understand correctly, from what my sister Marietta wrote, in which she did a beautiful job of telling the story, and Mother talked about it a lot, he tried more than once to go out, and he'd try different ways and on different days, and then finally decided the only way to go was down through Bunkerville and that way to get as far down there as he did. And so Mother said he had that feeling he had to get out there. He had to make sure his sheep herder was okay and that his sheep were good. And it wasn't a question of, well, I hope that they are. It was he needed to go see. And then the circumstances where someone was going to go with him and then didn't go with him she said, I have to see that as that was okay. That was the way it had to be.
Yeah, he said, when she said you probably ought to take somebody, and I think he said they'll just be in the way. And you can picture that when somebody knows where they're going and how to get there. And he's like, what am I going to do with them once we get out there, right? I don't know that he had ever seen snow like that, but he knew what he was doing, right? So,
And that's the thing. He was fully competent to go and do that. He wasn't stepping outside of what you might expect someone to do. It's just that the conditions were so much worse than probably anyone here in St. George could imagine.
Right, because it was bad here, but it was worse out there. So.
Yeah.
But he wasn't concerned when he didn't immediately come back that day either, because she knew he had things to do and that he knew where he was going and what he was doing.
So one of the things that growing up with Grandma, so my grandma would have been 65 when I was born. And so growing up, going over to her house and mowing her lawns and hearing all these stories, my grandma, when she would tell us these stories, especially as we were on Cedar Mountain, so we were in the place, and then she talked to us about that she got out a feeling, and Mom's been lucky enough to record that. And so we know this as kids, as cousins. So my brothers and sisters and all my first cousins, all us Gardners, we've heard this story. So I think, to me, it's one of the most sacred stories about my grandma, my relationship with my grandma and my grandpa, that Mom has always told us.
Well, for one thing, I had never heard this story. I'd been married for a lot of years, and the sweet thing about my mother was I heard her telling all of her grandchildren all the time, oh, Grandpa loved this, and Grandpa would have done this. And so she kept him alive. That's why all of them knew him without any of the grandchildren knowing. But my mother had a suitcase that was up on the top of the shelf in the pantry, and it had all of the clippings for when my dad died. I didn't know it until one time I thought, I'll see what's in that suitcase. But as Robert and Mother shared their letters that they'd written back and forth when Robert was in South Africa.
And that was during the time
yes, he had
father died.
Yeah.
His
son was on a mission in South Africa. And in one of the letters, this just touched my heart, and I'll read it to you. I have thought of your father. In fact, Burke, maybe you can read it, because
It needs to be a woman's voice. You'll do all right, Mom.
I have thought of your father so much since our conference here on January 8th, as he sat on the stand in the afternoon meeting. I looked at him and thought how thin and tired he looked. Then as I continued to look, I thought what a good man he was, how much good he had done and was doing, how everyone loved him, and how we all loved him, and what a swell father and husband he had been. As these thoughts raced through my mind, his whole countenance changed. I can hardly explain it. He almost looked spiritual. I have thought about it so much, even before he went away. Then something kept me thinking. I must get him some new, warmer underwear before he goes. I wouldn't want him not to have good clothes on if anything happened to him. I guess the Lord was trying to prepare me. I pray so that he will soon be found. I had never heard this story until I read Robert's letter. And it really helped me to understand a little more how she understood what she had to when he passed.
That's really beautiful. It really shows how important letters are, and those sharing those kind of feelings and thoughts through letters, and then having those letters survive.
Right.
Nowadays it's emails. Hopefully they'll survive, and hopefully our emails are written as beautifully and as thoughtfully and as heartfeltly as those letters.
When they were looking for my grandpa, because it took 30 days, from January 15th to February were looking for him, they were writing letters back and forth in beautiful cursive handwriting. And he's in Africa, South Africa. She's here. And we've kept them all. Mom's compiled them into a book. And they're like scripture, the most beautiful writing. One of the things that, again, when you asked why is this person so important, we always had a copy, and we actually have a copy of this up in the old homestead cabin on Cedar Mountain now that anybody can read. But I'm going to share, we have copies of the telegrams that the first presidency of the church sent to him while he was on his mission in South Africa. And I want you to listen, and you're going to find one line that's in both telegrams. And this is a powerful thing for our family. The first one was, can't find the date, but it was just a few days. Please notify Elder Robert Gardner, his father missing in snow, sub-zero weather since January 15th. Hopes of rescuing him fading. Mother desires Robert continue his mission. And then the next telegram says, please notify Elder Robert Gardner, father's body found in good condition. Mother desires that he remain on his mission. And so I know I was growing up, even like raising my own boys, I'm like, if you get a little sprained ankle or something, just tough it out, because we have somebody that's set a standard for hanging in there. And it's in our genes to go through tough things. And so that was always for me a testimony of a mother and a son, an oldest son. And you think about it, an oldest son who was going to take over the sheep herd, right? This was a family business that was going to, and now he's in South Africa. And he's trying to help his mother run a sheep herd from 3,000 miles away via letters. They're really fun to read and very spiritual. Yep. That telegram has always been a testimony to me of what we're about, what our family's about.
Thank you for sharing that, Burke.
Yep. And my feelings about Grandpa, I actually brought this pocket knife that Mom gave to me that was his. And I took it to a knife sharpener, and he knew exactly what it was. This is a knife that about everybody had back then. He knew what it was, and you can see it's been used. It's been used quite a bit. But Grandpa went as far as he could in his truck until he got stuck. And that's up the Grand Gulch Mine Road, which at that time was operable. Now it would be a really good off-road vehicle trail. You wouldn't want to try it unless you had a UTV.
And there might be spots where you wouldn't even make it.
It's a rock crawler. It's been floods, but anyway, he made it as far as he could, and then he walked the rest of the way. And I'll share my thoughts and then let Mom share hers, because these are only what we imagine, but we've been to the place where they found him, and he walked around 11 miles cross country in the snow with everything looking, it would look completely different. The landmarks wouldn't be there. Mom and I sometimes wonder if he took 2 days, maybe, because it would have taken a long time just to get to where he got stuck. But he made it to where his sheep were. And my Uncle Darrell, who, we'll talk about finding him, was one of the men that was there that found him. He told me that he feels like he got there and cut open some concentrates. I like alfalfa pellets. He had cut open some concentrates with that knife. And then he went over and sat down by a tree within sight of his sheep camp. I've always pictured him going up through those hills he'd spent his whole life, just exhausted, just tired, but he had a mission to get to those sheep, right? I was looking in John, I think it's chapter 10, and it says in verse 11, John 10:11, it says, I am the good shepherd, and the good shepherd giveth his life for the sheep. And I've always thought, he didn't know that he was doing that, but he was giving everything he had, and he gave everything he had, and then he just sat down to rest and was exhausted. But that was what he was about. And so for me, it's just been, like I say, a person I've never met that I feel like I know better than anybody. So anyway, I don't know what Mom's thoughts were. Her and my uncle they've retraced the path. And
We went out one year when it was like this, when there was no snow out there. Reed and I did. We actually went out on either the 15th of February or 15th of January. I can't remember. It's written down somewhere.
Yep.
But that was a really
February
neat
15th.
trip for us to go out and to walk as far as we could walk at that time, and wonder if it was 2 days, if he made it 2 days, or, to get where he was. And my feeling is, as soon as he saw smoke coming out of the sheep camp, he knew that his sheep herder was okay, and that's why he would sit to rest, was that he knew he was okay. Because I can't imagine him not hurrying on if he thought there was something he needed to take care of further on.
Tell us about how the community rallied during those days, those weeks, and as the family and friends and people came together to try to find your father, and praying and hoping that he would still be alive.
From what my mother has said, I don't think there was anyone in the community that didn't help if they could help. If it wasn't to go out with them, it was to get things ready for him to go out and to do. So many of the men in town that had machinery volunteered to take it out. Sheriff Prince at the time, and all of those people that had any way of helping came to help. And as I've grown up, I've heard people, when they've asked me about my parents and I've told them, they've said, "Oh, that was your dad. I remember I was the same age or a little older," and they knew the story. And I think that's part of this hometown feeling, is that everyone was concerned and everyone cared about him. And
yeah, it was fun for me to grow up and around, like, to know that Atwood Bundy was the truck driver, and Evan Woodbury was in the group, and there was Rex Gardner and Ras Gardner, and my uncle Darrell Bracken was probably the one that's my grandma's, my Aunt Ina's husband. Ina and Bessie are sisters, and Darrell and I spent a lot of time deer hunting. Now, we better throw a deer hunting story in here somewhere about Wayne Gardner, because there's a good one, but Darrell Brack and I spent enough time together. I knew how hard they tried and how cold it was and how much effort it took, because it takes a lot of effort to get out there in a nice four-wheel drive pickup with air conditioning and really good shocks and good tires. The snow was 5-6 feet deep. They had to break the trail all the way in a cat to get there, and they did, and they didn't give up. And the story of them finding him, and it goes back to the hat. It goes back to that, you're not going to wear that old hat. But that's the spirit that they had. And those names, you go and read those last names of that group, and that's who built this whole, that was who this whole county, this whole country was built on. And I'm sure they had a lot of things to worry about at that time too, but they didn't do any of that, and they got in there and they went out and they looked and they looked and they looked for a month until they found him. But they found that old hat, and that was the key. I've always wished we had that hat.
Well, this knife is so awesome.
Yeah.
It's so neat to...
Thinking that belongs in a shadow box in the old cabin on Cedar Mountain.
I'm glad it's not in a box. I'm glad I can hold it.
Yeah, you could hold it and open it. That's
awesome.
Probably true. Yep.
My goodness. Well, tell us about Bessie. When I think about Bessie, I think about her living that whole rest of the 20th century from 1949 until she died in 2002
3.
as a widow, but as this just amazing woman in our community.
Well, she didn't believe in letting anything get you down. But as she was grieving, an older woman told her, never, ever let your children see you cry. That was a mistake, because as a young girl, I thought my mother never did cry after my dad died. She must not have loved him like that. And I remember saying that to her when I had no idea. And so she told me years later, she said, every morning, as soon as there was enough light, I took a shovel and I went out in all the ditches and I dug all the Bermuda out of the ditches and cried because none of you could see me doing that. She said, I just miss your dad so much. I went over on their anniversary one time and she just sobbing. She said, I'd never heard her say that because she'd been told to keep it all together. So I tell people, you tell your kids to cry all they want and you're crying too.
Well, I think we understand and accept more about what it means to grieve.
Yeah.
Well, they didn't even take me to the funeral, but Betty Lou told me it wasn't because I was a misbehaving child. It was because they didn't do that then. Children needed to grieve.
Oh, my goodness.
And it was after my mother died that I actually grieved my father at the same time, and it was hard.
My goodness.
Yeah.
Catherine. Wow.
From a grandson. I'll speak from a grandchild of Bessie Gardner. It's spice cake, doodle bugs, playing in the ditch in front of her house. Every single one of us, I'm guessing, as we were married, had a $200 or $300 check put in our hand and closed the hand on it and just a little pat and just said, yeah, I thought you could use this. I would guess every married grandchild, when we would go on the deer hunt, she would make Wonder Bread sack full of Raisin Drop cookies, about as many as you could fit in the sack. They were stacked in there, and we didn't leave. Mom would make this good spaghetti like she makes, and we didn't leave deer hunting until that. She made the best gravy ever made, and when you went to her house for Sunday dinner, she never sat down. She just stood by the stove and moved stuff around. Her house, we still own it in the family. It still smells like it did, like it always has. The furniture in there is classic. The yard is gorgeous. Mom has worked really hard, and you could still go by. If you go by halfway up the block, you'll see it. But for us, Grandma was, when we had her 100th birthday party, she taught us about tithing. She could have spoke about anything, and she taught us about paying our tithing and giving a generous fast offering. You'll never feel bad if you do that. She kept copious, perfect books if someone owed her or didn't owe her. But I know Mom's told me stories about when my dad would go to pay her and she'd go, nope, I've got that paid in full.
Yeah.
No, it says right here in my book, paid in full, and here's the date. I don't know if you must have forgot something.
Well, he had come and done some work for her. And that was paid in full because he'd done this work where he'd gone without thinking it was a paid job. So
yeah. And a story I would pass on that I pass on to everyone that I meet about my grandma is the lesson I learned. I was mowing her lawns, and she came out on the front porch with a beautiful glass jar of lemonade with the little flecks in it. And it was hot, and she had Bermuda grass, and it was hard to mow. I was probably 12, and she came out with a glass and a glass pitcher, and she says, Burke, I was dumping the bag. She goes, do you want some lemonade? And I don't know why it came out of my mouth, but I said, I don't care. And she turned around and walked back in the house. And I'm like, well, that was really dumb. So I finished the lawns and went in, and she'd always pay me when I got done. And she went in and she goes, can I tell you a little story? She said, when I was a little girl, my mother was making rice pudding. And I loved rice pudding, and it smelled so good. And I sat there and watched her make it, and I thought, oh, I hope I can have some of that rice pudding. And she said, Bessie, do you want some rice pudding? And I don't know why it came out of my mouth, but I said, I don't care. And her mother said, well, I don't care either. And she said, and I learned that when I was a little girl. And so I just want you, Burke, throughout your life, when someone offers you something, if you want it, you say, oh, I would love some of that. Or, no, I think I'm okay. But don't be a fence sitter. She said, don't say I don't care, because that's just not a proper thing to say. And I love it when somebody says, hey, can I buy you a shake now? And I'm like, absolute. Oh, who doesn't want a shake, right? But sometimes we go, no, I'm good. And so that has stuck with me. And I have passed that down to all my kids. In fact, the word I tell them is, you bet. I'd love one. And so she was an angel on the earth, I feel like. Perfect name, Bessie MacArthur Gardner. You don't get much more rooted than that. Yep.
Well, I'm looking at a photograph right now. It's one of the most iconic photographs I've ever seen of Utah's Dixie, of a woman in a dress dancing on a pinnacle on the red hill with the D on the black hill, and she looks like an angel. And I've just learned today that it's Bessie Gardner, Bessie MacArthur Gardner. And the reason it was in that yearbook in the 1920s
Probably.
is because she was Miss Dixie Spirit.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And we talk a lot about this idea of the Dixie Spirit, but your mom and your grandma she embodied that more than a century ago. And not only in her being, but in this photograph, which is so awesome. Sometimes I wish we were on video so we could show some awesome things like this. But anyway, tell us how all of this relates to the Dixie Spirit.
Well, my mother, of course, being raised by the MacArthurs, they had the Dixie Spirit. But Grandma Lizzie and Grandpa Jim, everything about that my grandfather Jim did when he was a mayor, the things that he did towards getting a new library and doing all these things. They wanted to build this place up. It meant so much to them because Daniel D. MacArthur had come in here with the hand carts and brought people in here. And so they've always had really strong feelings about the schools and everything about this town. This was their home, and they wanted it to be all it could be. And I think my mother was that way, and she was so proud to be from Dixie and go to Dixie College, and she did everything she could to support Dixie College and encouraged every one of us to go to school and get an education. But everyone was so close-knit and cared about each other. It was like it was in the olden days when everyone was concerned about everyone in this town. And that's one of the bad things about it growing, but there's still that here.
Let me just share one little paragraph from what she wrote in that yearbook. No matter how far away we may go, there is still a warm spot in the heart of every real Dixie student. It calls out, Dixie. Where we lived, Dixie. The home of true worth, Dixie. The school of all schools, Dixie. We love thee. That's just one little excerpt from a really beautiful essay that she wrote. But that, there again, she embodied that.
Yeah.
My mom she has a gift for family history. Now, I'm not going to say genealogy, but family history. She has kept and compiled and told. If we were live, you'd see over here a book that's a foot deep of A.K. and Orilla Hafen, your grandma and grandpa, my great-grandma and grandpa. And she's got one for Johann Georg Staheli that she's married into. She's married into A.K. and Orilla. She's got books on Wayne Gardner. She's just done amazing things. A couple of years ago, I went on a Disney cruise, and this movie was coming out. And this movie was called Coco. And I asked my son, he goes, "Oh, Dad, you'll like it. You'll cry. You'll cry." And I went and I watched it. But the general idea of Coco was there was a man who had passed on that was not going to be remembered. And the idea was that you die once when you die, but you die again when no one on earth remembers you. If there's no one on earth that can tell a story about you, then you're no longer remembered. And so my grandma in passing these down, then to my mom, and then to us, and then to our children, I think about this. Why is it that Wayne Gardner, my grandpa Gardner, is the most memorable person to me in my life? And when a couple of years ago, my son was in the junior prom royalty assembly, and they pulled a thing out, a question. I have the little questions, and they said, question, if you could spend a day with someone living or dead, who would it be and what would you do? And he immediately said, oh, I would go deer hunting on Cedar Mountain with my great-grandpa Gardner. And I'm like, okay. Mom talks a lot about building bridges. That's what this is about. He lived to be 49. I love your show, and I know the people that listen to it. I love the people that you've interviewed. I would encourage everyone, if you have not done so, to tell your generations younger than you everything you know about everyone you know, so that they live on in that way, right? We know they live on in other ways, but so that people can keep learning from them. And this is what spurred her on to write this book about Grandpa. She said, there's a quote by Dennis B. Neuenschwander, and maybe that's our message. If I want my children and grandchildren to know those who still live in my memories, then I must build the bridge between them. I alone am the link to the generations that stand on either side of me. My grandchildren will have no knowledge of their family's history if I do nothing to preserve it for them. A life that is not documented is a life that within a generation or two will largely be lost to memory. What a tragedy that can be in the history of a family. Knowledge of our ancestors shapes us and instills within us values that give direction and meaning to our lives. And then Sister Mary Ellen Smoot said, I am convinced that as we study the lives of those who have gone before, we are influenced by their testimonies and strength. I know that family stories can become legacies of faith in our lives. I know our generation, Mom is the last person still living of her brothers and sisters, but I know that her generation has done that for us. And it's our role to do that for our kids and our grandkids. And we don't be too preachy, but I hope everybody out there that this pricks them a little bit and says, you know what? We need to get together and turn on a phone. We don't even need an old tape recorder. Turn on a phone and start asking questions. Because there's a few stories I've heard today that I didn't even know from my own mom.
Thanks, Burke. And thanks, Katherine. This has been such a wonderful hour. There's so many more things that I'd love to talk about and that we could talk about, but we're going to need to bring this particular visit to a close. And I just want to express to you how much I love and appreciate both of you. And thank you on behalf of our listeners for sharing so beautifully these stories today. And I think the name of this podcast is Not Forgotten, and that's what we're all about here today. And Wayne and Bessie Gardner will not be forgotten. Thanks.
Thank you for the privilege.
The Doc Booth Foundation is dedicated to empowering individuals through educational opportunities and promoting mental health advocacy. Through scholarships and funding for important community needs, the foundation perpetuates the can-do spirit of the founders of this community, using the lessons of the past to chart the course for a better future. Make your tax-deductible donation at docboothfoundation.org. Not Forgotten is produced by Ricky Valadez and made possible by the generous support of St. George Area Zag Stores, industry-leading tech support and accessories. Lyman Hafen's books can be found at lymanhafen.com.
Once I lived in Cottonwood and owned a little farm. When they called me down to Dixie, it caused me much alarm. To hoe the cane and cotton, I right away must go. But the reason why they sent me, I'm sure I do not know. We came to Dixie, and we called it home. Oh, in Dixie, we've lived and grown. But the reason why they sent me, I'm sure I do not know.